They burned his clothes in the front yard while the neighbors watched. They laughed as the flames took his only good suit, his work shirts, everything he owned, and they told him he was nothing, that he had always been nothing. What they did not know was that the quiet, patient man standing in the ash and smoke had just inherited $83 billion. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Stay right there, because this story is about to show you exactly what a real reckoning looks like. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like button right now and make sure you are subscribed so you never miss what comes next. Now, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. So whether you are tuning in from Lagos, London, Toronto, Nairobi, Houston, or somewhere in between, I want to hear from you. Let us get into it. Marcus Ellison was not a man who demanded attention. He had never wanted it. He was the kind of person who arrived early and left quietly, who fixed the broken things without being asked, who filled the silence in a room without crowding it. He was a maintenance supervisor at a mid-size manufacturing plant on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, and he wore his uniform like a second skin. Steel-toed boots, a collared shirt with his name stitched above the breast pocket, and the same calm expression whether the day brought routine or disaster. He had married Vanessa Hartwell 6 years before the day his world collapsed and then reconstructed itself into something unrecognizable. He had loved her, or believed that he had, in the way a man loves something he has worked hard to build. He had overlooked the contempt in her voice when she introduced him to her colleagues. He had ignored the way her mother, Sylvia Hartwell, looked at him, like a stain that had not quite come out in the wash. He had told himself it was class anxiety, cultural friction, something that would soften with time and shared history. It never softened, it calcified. He had met Vanessa at a work function 8 years earlier, a corporate dinner for the plant's management team which Vanessa had attended as the guest of a regional sales director. She had been wearing a red dress and speaking loudly about a vacation she had taken in the south of France. Marcus had been seated at the same table through no particular design. They had spoken, and she had laughed at something he said, and for a few hours she had looked at him the way people look at things they find genuinely surprising. He had been foolish enough to believe that look would last. In the early months of their relationship, Vanessa's family had been on their best behavior. Sylvia had been gracious at the first dinner, asking Marcus questions about his work with the careful neutrality of someone taking a deposition. Derek had shaken his hand firmly and clapped him on the shoulder and called him a solid guy, which Marcus had not known at the time was the highest compliment Derek ever paid to anyone he considered beneath him. The condescension came later, incrementally, the way cold moves into a house when the insulation starts to fail. First, a comment here, then a dismissal there, then an atmosphere so thoroughly saturated with their contempt that it became indistinguishable from the air itself. The Hartwells were a family built entirely on the appearance of wealth. Sylvia presided over their social circle like a minor queen, hosting brunches and charity galas with a generosity that was really just performance. She gave to causes not because she believed in them, but because her name in a program had a value she had calculated precisely. She spoke about struggle with the practiced sympathy of someone who had never once been afraid of the rent. Her husband, who had nominally created the family's financial foundation, had been dead for 9 years. What he left behind was enough to fund the performance for a few years, but Sylvia spent with the disregard of someone who assumed the supply was infinite. It was not. By the time Marcus married Vanessa, the family's actual finances were considerably more fragile than the dining room furniture suggested. Her son, Vanessa's older brother Derek, had inherited her gift for spectacle. He drove a car that was 2 lease payments behind, wore suits that were bought on credit, and spoke about business ventures with the authority of a man who had never successfully completed one. He had a habit of arriving at restaurants first and ordering expensive wine for the table before anyone else had sat down, which created the impression of a man who did not look at price lists. The impression was the point. He had never liked Marcus, not from the first handshake. "You're a maintenance man," Derek had said once, at Thanksgiving, in front of the entire table, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Nothing wrong with that, I suppose. Someone has to fix the toilets." Vanessa had laughed. Not loudly, but she had laughed. Marcus had said nothing. He had cut his turkey, poured more water, and listened to the conversation drift elsewhere. That was his way. He stored things quietly in a place the Hartwells could not reach. He had grown up in a different world entirely. A small house in East Columbus with his grandfather Raymond Ellison, a man of almost no words and absolute dignity. Raymond had worked the land for most of his life, then pivoted to real estate in a quiet and methodical way, buying parcels of land in areas that everyone else was leaving behind, holding them with the patience of someone who understood time as an investment. He had never talked about money with the excitement or anxiety that other people brought to the subject. He treated it the way a craftsman treats a tool, useful, necessary, not something to worship or fear, but something to handle with knowledge and care. He had never needed to display what he had. He wore the same coat for 15 years. He drove a truck that was older than Marcus. He grew tomatoes in the backyard in summer and gave most of them away to neighbors. And yet when Marcus was 12 years old, Raymond had sat him down at the kitchen table and said the only piece of financial wisdom he ever offered directly. "Marcus," he had said, folding his hands on the table, "the loudest people in the room are always the ones with the least to protect. Remember that." Marcus had remembered it every single day of his marriage. Raymond Ellison died on a Thursday in late October, 2 months before the story reaches its hinge point. He passed in his sleep in the house he had owned for 41 years, with no drama and no final speeches. The funeral was small. Raymond had wanted it that way. Marcus stood at the graveside with his mother, 2 cousins, and an old friend of Raymond's named Clarence, who had travelled 6 hours by bus to be there. The Hartwells had not attended. Vanessa had sent a text message that said she had a prior engagement she could not move. That night, back at the house he and Vanessa shared in the suburb of Westbrook, Marcus had sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold beside him. He missed Raymond in a way that was physical, like something had been removed from the center of his chest without anesthetic. He did not cry. He sat in the silence and breathed through it. Vanessa came home at 11:30. She had been at a dinner with Derek and some of his business associates. She smelled of expensive wine and someone else's perfume, not hers. She walked past the kitchen without stopping, then paused and leaned against the doorframe. "You should really think about cleaning this place up," she said, looking at the kitchen. It was not dirty. It was simply lived in. "It's depressing." She went to bed. Marcus stayed at the table until 2 in the morning. The package arrived 11 days after the funeral. It came by certified mail, addressed specifically to Marcus Jerome Ellison in the handwriting of a woman named Eleanor Voss, who identified herself in the enclosed letter as the senior partner of Voss, Carrington and Blake, an estate and trust law firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. The letter was brief and formal. It informed Marcus that he had been named the sole beneficiary of the estate of Raymond Claude Ellison, and that given the complexity and scale of the estate, she strongly recommended he travel to Atlanta at his earliest convenience to meet in person. Marcus read the letter 3 times, then he folded it carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the inside pocket of his work jacket. He said nothing to Vanessa. This was not a calculated decision in that moment. It was instinct, the same instinct that had kept him silent at 100 Hartwell dinner tables, the same instinct Raymond himself had lived by. He did not know what the letter meant in concrete terms. He only knew that it was his, and that the people in his house had not earned the right to know about it yet. 3 days later, he told Vanessa he was taking a long weekend to attend to some administrative matters related to his grandfather's affairs. She nodded without looking up from her phone. "Don't be dramatic about it," she said. "It's just paperwork." He drove to Atlanta alone. The offices of Voss, Carrington and Blake were on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street that Marcus almost walked past twice, because nothing about its exterior announced what it was. Eleanor Voss met him herself in the lobby. A tall woman in her 60s with silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by anything except competence. She shook his hand firmly and led him to a conference room that overlooked the city. "Mr. Ellison," she said, settling into her chair and opening the folder in front of her. "I want to say first that your grandfather was one of the most methodical and far-sighted clients I have worked with in 30 years of practice. What he built is extraordinary, and he built it quietly." Marcus sat very still. "How extraordinary?" he asked. Eleanor Voss looked at him steadily. "Before I give you the numbers, I want you to understand the structure, because the number alone will be disorienting without it." Raymond Ellison, she explained, had begun acquiring land in the 1970s, rural parcels, abandoned industrial corridors, neglected urban plots in cities across the southeast and Midwest. He had done it through a series of limited liability companies with names that meant nothing to anyone looking in from the outside. Ellison Ag Holdings, Four Corners Land Trust, Blue Ridge Parcel Group. Over 5 decades, quietly and without fanfare, those parcels had appreciated, been developed in partnership with other investors, spun off into commercial real estate portfolios, and in several cases landed directly in the path of major infrastructure projects that drove their value into the stratosphere. Highway expansions, logistics hubs, residential developments that grew up around land Raymond had paid almost nothing for in 1981. Raymond had also, through one of his holding companies, acquired a 15% stake in a regional logistics firm in 2003 that had since been absorbed by a national freight conglomerate. That stake, held in trust, had grown into something staggering. There were also agricultural revenue streams, a portfolio of commercial leases that generated income quarterly, and 2 parcels in Georgia and Tennessee that were subject to mineral extraction agreements worth, on their own, more than most people would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. Eleanor Voss turned a single page in the folder to face Marcus. The number printed there was 83,400,000,000 and some change. Marcus looked at it. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he looked up at Eleanor Voss, and for the first time in years, he felt something shift behind his sternum. Not joy, exactly, but a kind of tectonic settling, like a fault line finally completing its movement after building pressure for decades. "He never said a word," Marcus said quietly. "He told me once," Eleanor replied, "that the wrong people knowing about money is how money disappears." "He trusted you, Mr. Ellison, completely. You are the only beneficiary. There is no secondary designation, no alternative clause. Everything, every entity, every parcel, every trust, every holding, transfers to you." Marcus nodded once. He asked for a glass of water. he spent 2 full days in Atlanta. He met with Eleanor Voss for hours at a stretch, working through the architecture of what Raymond had built. He was introduced to the lead asset manager, a precise and energetic man named Theodore Park, who had been managing Raymond's portfolio under Eleanor's legal oversight for 11 years. Theodore spoke about the holdings the way other people spoke about living things, with attention and investment. Marcus asked good questions. Theodore noticed. On the evening of the second day, sitting in his hotel room with the city lights spreading out below him, Marcus made a decision. Not about money, not about strategy, about honesty. He called his cousin Darnell, who worked in tech and was the one person in Marcus's family who operated with total discretion. He told Darnell everything. Darnell was silent for a long time. "You haven't told Vanessa?" Darnell said. It was not a question. "No." Another silence. "Marcus, do you trust her?" Marcus looked at the city below. He thought about the Thanksgiving table. He thought about the text message sent on the day of his grandfather's funeral. He thought about the perfume that was not hers. "No," he said, "I don't think I do." "Then don't," Darnell said simply. "Not yet. Figure out what you're dealing with first." Marcus drove home the following morning. He told Vanessa the trip had been administrative, signing documents, authorizing the release of Raymond's personal effects. She accepted this without interest. She was on her phone. She was always on her phone. What Marcus did not know, not yet, was that while he was in Atlanta, something else had been happening at home. Vanessa had been conducting her own parallel life for longer than he suspected. The man's name was Brendan Cole, and he was Derek Hartwell's business associate. The kind of man who wore confidence like cologne, expensively and in excess. Brendan had money, or appeared to, which was the only currency that truly mattered to the Hartwells. He drove the right car, he said the right things at the right tables. He had a talent for making women feel chosen rather than convenient, which was perhaps the most useful, deceptive gift he possessed. He had been telling Vanessa for the better part of 8 months that she deserved better than a man who came home smelling of machine oil. He told her this over dinners she had said she was attending with friends. He told her this in text messages she deleted before she got home. He had a practiced fluency in the language of flattery that Vanessa, raised by Sylvia Hartwell, was entirely susceptible to, not because she was unintelligent, but because she had been taught from childhood that a man's worth was measured by his visible assets, and Brendan's assets were extremely visible. Vanessa had agreed that she deserved better. Derek knew about the relationship and had actively encouraged it, not out of loyalty to Vanessa, but because Brendan had agreed to bring him in on a business venture that required the kind of social credibility that being connected to the Hartwell family name provided. It was a transaction dressed in family feeling. That was always the way with the Hartwells. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday morning in December, 6 weeks after Marcus returned from Atlanta. He had woken early. As always, he had made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a legal brief Eleanor had sent him, one of a series of documents he was quietly working through with her team to consolidate and restructure certain holdings under his direct management. He kept these documents in a locked briefcase that he stored in the trunk of his car. He had brought the brief inside just for the morning, intending to return it before Vanessa woke. She woke early. She came downstairs, saw the papers on the table, and asked what they were. Marcus said they were estate documents. She pressed. He deflected. And in the friction of that small morning argument, something that had been building for years finally cracked the surface. "I've been thinking," Vanessa said, her voice taking on the particular flatness it always had when she had already made a decision and was simply announcing it. that this isn't working anymore. Marcus said nothing. He folded the brief and set it aside. "I've spoken to Derek," she continued, "and I've also spoken to a lawyer. I think we both know this marriage has run its course." Still Marcus said nothing. Vanessa seemed thrown by this. She had expected argument, perhaps pleading. She pressed forward. "I've already found an apartment. I'm going to need you to make arrangements to move out. You can have the weekends to collect your things. I'll be staying here." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I'll need a few days to think." "There's nothing to think about," she said. "I've already decided." He nodded and went upstairs to shower. While he was upstairs, Vanessa called Derek, and Derek called Brendan. And by noon, the three of them had converged on the house with a bottle of champagne and a plan. They sat at Marcus's kitchen table in Marcus's house and toasted to Vanessa's freedom, to new beginnings, and to the fact that the maintenance man would be out of their lives by the end of the month. Marcus came downstairs to find them there. Brendan was in his chair. Derek looked at him with that same smiling contempt. "Come on, Marcus. Don't make this ugly. You're a reasonable man. You've always known you didn't belong in this life." Marcus looked at Brendan. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at Derek. He said nothing. He took his coffee mug from the counter, rinsed it in the sink, placed it in the drying rack, and walked back upstairs. That was the moment. That single, quiet action in the face of their cruelty. That was when the last of his patience transformed into something else. Something colder, more precise, and entirely patient in a new way. The burning of his clothes happened 2 days later. Vanessa had gone through his wardrobe while he was at work. She had changed the locks, a move her lawyer had apparently advised against, but which she did anyway. A choice that would later become legally significant. And she had placed his belongings in the front yard in black garbage bags. Derek and Brendan were there, as if it were an occasion, as if they had planned their attendance. Someone, it was never entirely clear who, had the idea of the fire. There was a lighter, and there was accelerant, and there was the ugly pleasure of people who mistake cruelty for power. It started with his old work jacket, then the clothes he wore on evenings and weekends. Then the suit he had worn to Raymond's funeral, the one that had been pressed carefully, worn once, and stored with the quiet reverence Marcus gave to things that mattered. The neighbours came out to watch. 2 of them filmed it on their phones. One woman, 3 houses down, later said she had almost gone to intervene, but something about the way the 3 of them were laughing made her feel afraid of their certainty. Marcus arrived home to find the fire already burning low, the smoke curling up in the cold afternoon air. He stood at the edge of the property. She had changed the locks, so legally it was complicated. And he watched. Derek said something to him across the yard, something about new beginnings and dead weight. Brendan laughed. Vanessa stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, like she was watching something she had earned. A neighbour later described the expression on Marcus's face as terrifyingly calm, like a man watching weather, like a man who already knew how the storm ended. Marcus called Darnell that night from his cousin's couch where he was staying. "They burned my grandfather's funeral suit," he said. Darnell's voice was very quiet when he responded, "Tell me everything, and then let's talk to Eleanor." The call to Eleanor Voss happened the next morning. Marcus laid out the timeline, the conduct, the burning, the locked doors. Eleanor listened without interruption. When he was finished, she was quiet for precisely 4 seconds. "Marcus," she said, "do you want justice, or do you want to be done with it? because those are two different strategies." "Both," he said. Eleanor allowed herself something that almost became a smile. "Then let's begin." What followed was 3 weeks of coordinated and meticulous preparation. The first and most significant revelation came not from Eleanor's team, but from Theodore Park, who, in reviewing the full asset structure, had flagged something remarkable. The house in Westbrook, the house Vanessa had changed the locks on, the house where his clothes had burned, in the front yard, had not been purchased by Marcus and Vanessa jointly, as both of them believed. It had been purchased in 2019 by a holding company called Ellison Blue Ridge Residential Trust, which was one of Raymond's shell entities, and which had transferred fully to Marcus upon Raymond's death. Vanessa's name was on no document related to that property. Not the deed, not the mortgage, not anything. She had changed the locks on a house she did not own. The mortgage payments she believed she and Marcus had been making jointly had in fact been flowing entirely from the trust, automatically, in a structure Raymond had set up when Marcus first told him he was getting married and looking to buy a home. Raymond had not said a word about it. He had simply ensured that Marcus would always have a foundation the Hartwells could not touch. Eleanor brought in a property attorney named Gabriel Santos, who worked with her regularly on trust-adjacent real estate matters. Gabriel reviewed everything and confirmed it without ambiguity. The property belonged to Marcus Ellison entirely and exclusively. Vanessa had no legal claim. Her attorney, when he eventually received the documentation Gabriel prepared, reportedly sat in silence for a full minute before responding. But there was more. Darnell, working on Marcus's behalf and with his explicit authorization, had done some quiet investigation into Derek Hartwell's business activities, specifically the venture he had been promoting for the past 18 months to various investors, including Brendan Cole. It was a logistics and warehousing company called Hartwell Premier Distribution, which Derek had presented to investors as having secured 3 anchor contracts with regional retailers and a letter of intent from a national grocery chain. None of these contracts existed. Darnell found this by pulling public business filings, cross-referencing the claimed client names, and speaking off the record with one of Derek's former investors who had already begun to suspect the truth. The evidence was not circumstantial, it was documented. There were investment presentations that made specific representations about contracts that did not exist. There were wire transfers of investor capital into accounts that had then been used to fund Derek's personal lifestyle. This was not a failed business, it was fraud. Marcus placed a call to a federal fraud hotline from a number that could not be traced back to him. The referral included a detailed summary prepared by Darnell with every document attached, and then they moved to the house. Gabriel Santos sent a formal notice to Vanessa's attorney via certified mail, advising that the property at the Westbrook address was the sole property of Marcus Jerome Ellison, held in trust, and that the current unauthorized occupant was required to vacate within 30 days. The letter further noted that the unauthorized changing of the locks constituted trespass, and that the destruction of personal property on the premises, and documented by 2 neighbors' videos now in the possession of Marcus's legal team, would be addressed separately. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Vanessa called Marcus within 3 hours of receiving it. Her voice was at a register he had not heard from her before, something between fury and the early stages of real fear. "What is this?" she demanded. "What is this document?" "It's a legal notice," Marcus said. "You should have your lawyer explain it to you." "This is our house, Marcus. I have rights." "You have 30 days, he said. "That's what the document says." She called Derek immediately after. Derek called his own lawyer. His lawyer read the property documentation, called a friend in real estate law, and called Derek back. The conversation was brief. Derek's voice, for the first time in memory, had no performance in it. He called Vanessa back and said, with the flat affect of a man receiving bad news from a doctor, "It's real. His name is on everything. We don't have a play here." But the house was only the beginning. The fraud referral had moved faster than anyone expected. A federal investigator made initial contact with Derek's former investor, the one Darnell had spoken with, within 2 weeks of the anonymous tip. By the 3rd week, Derek received a notice that his business accounts were subject to a preliminary review under a financial fraud inquiry. His bank froze 2 of his accounts pending the investigation. His access to a line of credit he had been using to fund Hartwell Premier Distribution's operating expenses was suspended. The lease on his office space, which he had maintained largely for the optics of having an office, went into arrears within days of the account freeze. The landlord's representative called 3 times in 1 week. The lease on his car, the one he drove with such deliberate visibility through the neighborhood, was already 30 days past due. The dealership sent a notice. Derek called Sylvia and asked, for what was apparently not the first time in recent years, for a bridge loan. Sylvia told him, for the first time, that she did not have the liquidity to help him. There was a silence on the phone between them that carried the weight of an entire family mythology finally cracking under examination. Brendan Cole, who had invested $240,000 into Derek's venture and whose name was on several of the promotional documents as a co-presenter at investor meetings, received a letter from a regulatory body asking him to preserve all communications related to Hartwell Premier Distribution. He contacted Derek in a state of controlled panic. Derek did not handle it gracefully. There was a phone call that became an argument, and then something very close to a breakdown on Derek's part. Vanessa learned about the investigation, not from Derek, but from a mutual friend who had seen Derek at a restaurant behaving erratically. She called Marcus again. "Did you do this?" she asked. Her voice was different now. The fear had eclipsed the fury. "I referred information I became aware of to the appropriate authorities," Marcus said. "That's all I did." "You destroyed him," she said. "Derek destroyed himself," Marcus said. "I just stopped looking away." The final confrontation was not in a courtroom and not in a formal legal setting. It was, perhaps fittingly, in the house that Vanessa was being required to vacate. She had requested, through her attorney, a final walkthrough, a chance to collect personal items that were genuinely hers and to say whatever she needed to say. Marcus agreed to be present. He arrived before she did and stood in the living room in a new coat, not expensive, just clean and whole, and waited. Gabriel Santos waited with him. Eleanor Voss had offered to send a representative, but Marcus said it was not necessary. He was composed. He had been composing himself for this for 31 days. Vanessa arrived with Sylvia Hartwell, her mother, who had apparently insisted on accompanying her. Sylvia swept into the living room with the expression of a woman who had never learned that the world could refuse her. "I don't know who you think you are," Sylvia said, addressing Marcus before he had even spoken. "You are a maintenance worker, a working man. You do not treat my daughter like this. You do not send legal papers to her home." "It isn't her home," Marcus said. He said it without sharpness, without cruelty, simply as fact. Sylvia's mouth continued to move for a moment without producing words. Vanessa stood behind her, holding a box of personal items. Her eyes were red. She looked like someone who had not been sleeping. "Marcus," she said, Can we talk, without lawyers?" Gabriel Santos stepped discreetly to the far side of the room, but did not leave. Marcus looked at Vanessa, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years, or perhaps it was she who had never really looked at him before and now could not stop. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he spoke. Not with anger, with the precision of a man who had decided that clarity was the most devastating thing he could offer. "You spent 6 years treating me like a man who should be grateful for the privilege of being in your life," he said. "You let your family humiliate me at tables I helped pay for, in houses I helped maintain, at celebrations I helped fund. You laughed when your brother called me a toilet fixer. You sent a text message on the day we buried the greatest man I ever knew. You changed the locks on a house you didn't own. You stood on the porch and watched my grandfather's funeral suit burn." Vanessa's lips were pressed together so hard they had gone white. "And for the last month," Marcus continued, "while your brother's business unraveled and your boyfriend discovered that being adjacent to a fraud investigation is its own kind of ruin, you have been calling me, not because you suddenly understand who I am, but because you are afraid of what I have." Sylvia made a sound that was not quite a word. "Your grandfather's estate," Vanessa said. How much is it, Marcus? All the documents they've sent, the trust numbers, I couldn't—" "It doesn't matter," Marcus said. "It matters. It doesn't matter," he said again, and the second time was quieter and more final than the first. "Because no amount would change what you did, and no amount will give you access to what I have. Not $1, not this house, not my name." Sylvia Hartwell, who had built her entire identity on the architecture of financial and social leverage, looked at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. And what she saw clearly terrified her, not because he had money, but because he had decided. He was not the man who had sat silently through 100 dinners. He was not the man who swallowed insults and kept cutting his turkey. He was Raymond Ellison's grandson, and he had inherited something much more important than money. He had inherited the knowledge of when to move. "Collect what's yours," Marcus said to Vanessa. "You have 60 minutes, and then I'd like you to leave my house." Sylvia swept out first without another word, which was somehow worse than anything she could have said. Vanessa collected her box, and 2 more that she and her mother loaded quietly into Sylvia's car. She came back to the doorway one final time. "I didn't know," she said, and she might have meant the money, or the house, or Raymond, or the man Marcus actually was. It was impossible to say. "I know you didn't," Marcus said. "That was always the problem." She left. The door closed. Gabriel Santos looked at Marcus and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The aftermath unfolded in the months that followed with the quiet inevitability of consequences long overdue. Derek Hartwell was formally charged with securities fraud and wire fraud in connection with Hartwell Premier Distribution. 11 investors had been affected. The total amount misappropriated was $2.4 million. He entered a plea agreement that included restitution, a significant fine, and a felony conviction that effectively ended any prospect of him conducting business in a regulated industry again. His social credibility, which had been the single most precious thing he possessed, evaporated within weeks of the charges becoming public record. Brendan Cole was not charged criminally. Investigators determined his knowledge of the fraud was partial and his role more negligent than conspiratorial. But the civil fallout was severe. His investment loss, the legal fees, and the reputational damage from being named in regulatory documents effectively ended his professional standing in the circles that mattered to him. He and Vanessa separated 3 months after she moved out of Westbrook. Vanessa retained a divorce attorney and pursued a settlement negotiation that lasted 4 months and ended in an agreement that reflected the reality of their situation. No jointly held assets, no shared property, and a marriage that had lasted 6 years in name but considerably less in substance. She received what she had come into the marriage with, plus a modest settlement that Marcus agreed to without contest. He had not wanted a war, he had wanted clarity. Sylvia Hartwell told people in her social circle that Vanessa's divorce had been amicable and dignified. No one who knew the full story believed her, but she said it with such conviction that some people were confused. Marcus returned to the house in Westbrook and stood in the living room the evening after Vanessa's move was completed. He had repaired the lock himself, not because he could not hire someone, but because it was a simple mechanical problem and he liked to fix things with his hands. He stood in the quiet house and breathed. It smelled like wood and old paint and the cold air of December again, almost exactly a year after Raymond had died. He thought of his grandfather standing in the kitchen of the East Columbus house. He thought of those folded hands on the table. He thought of the words, "The loudest people in the room are always the ones with the least to protect." Raymond had never been loud. Marcus had inherited that too. In the spring, Marcus met with Theodore Park and Eleanor Voss in Atlanta to begin the more significant work of deciding what to do with what he had. He was clear from the beginning about his priorities. He wanted the holdings to continue operating as Raymond had built them, methodically, without spectacle. He increased the salary of every employee across the holding entities whose compensation fell below a livable threshold. He established a scholarship fund in Raymond's name through a community foundation in East Columbus, targeting first-generation college students. He funded a small business grant program in the neighborhood where Raymond had grown up, specifically for people who had good ideas and no access to capital. Exactly the position Raymond himself had once stood in decades before the world had any idea who he was. He kept his job at the manufacturing plant for 4 more months, not because he needed to, but because he had people there who depended on the systems he managed, and he wanted to ensure a proper transition. He trained his replacement personally. He brought donuts on his last day. He shook every hand on the floor. One of the older workers, a man named Gus, who had been at the plant for 22 years, told Marcus he was the best supervisor he had ever worked under. Marcus thanked him and meant it. He was not grateful for the compliment because of where he was going. He was grateful for it because of where he had been. He did not buy a larger house. He renovated the one he had. He did not buy a different car. He kept the one he knew. He ate the same meals he had always eaten, walked the same morning route he had walked for 11 years, and called Darnell on Sunday evenings to talk about basketball and family. Eleanor Voss said to him once during a visit to Atlanta that she had worked with a great many people who had come into significant wealth. She said that in her experience, the ones who handled it worst were the ones who had spent their entire lives feeling like they deserved more. They confused the money with the vindication, she said. They spent trying to prove something to people who were not paying attention anymore. Marcus had nodded slowly. Raymond understood that, he said. You understand it too, she replied. He met a woman named Adaze in the autumn at a community fundraiser for a youth sports organization he had begun quietly supporting. She was a pediatric nurse who laughed readily and spoke her mind without performance. She asked him what he did, and he said he managed investments and had worked in manufacturing maintenance for most of his career. She said that was interesting and asked which part he had liked better. He had thought about it genuinely for a moment. The maintenance, he said. I like fixing things that are broken. She had smiled at that. There was nothing complicated in the smile. It was simply warm. They had coffee the following week, and the week after that, sections. He told her about Raymond on their third meeting, sitting in a diner with the winter light coming through the window, and she listened the way some people listen. Not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually receiving what he was saying. He did not tell her about the money, not that day, but he told her about the kitchen table, the coat worn for 15 years, the truck older than Marcus, and the folded hands. She said quietly, He sounds like someone who understood what mattered. He was the wisest person I ever knew, Marcus said. There is a version of this story that ends with a number, with 83 billion in bold type and a cascade of zeros that fills the imagination. But that version misses the point entirely. Raymond Ellison had not built what he built in order to produce a number. He had built it the way a man builds a wall against the cold, steadily, brick by brick, with no audience, because the purpose was protection and not performance. And he had given it to the one person he knew would understand that. Marcus Ellison did not use his inheritance to punish the people who had wronged him. He did not need to. He simply stopped absorbing the consequences of their cruelty, which was the most devastating thing he could have done to people who had always assumed his endurance was weakness. What they had called compliance was composure. What they had called civility was patience. What they had called weakness was the long, unhurried silence before a man decides to act. And when he acted, it was not with noise or spectacle. It was with documents and legal notices, and a single calm sentence across a living room to a woman who had stood on a porch and watched his grandfather's suit burn. That, in the end, was the inheritance that mattered most. Now let me ask you something before you go. What would you have done in Marcus's position? If you had just discovered what he discovered, the house, the fortune, the fraud, how would you have played it? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like. It means more than you know and helps this channel reach people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, do that now, because there is another story coming that you are going to want to be here for. Take care of yourselves out there. I will see you in the next video.